When you walked in here tonight, if you look around, I don't know how many people here, but this is an absolute marvelous thing. Think about it for a second. When the Big Book was written in 1938, early 39, there were only as many people in all of Alcoholics Anonymous as there are here tonight. And what sometimes, you know, when we come in to AA, we think, boy, this thing it's already grown up, it's already there, it's probably been here forever. It's amazing, isn't it? 65 years ago, there was no hope for any of us. We were dead ducks. There was no AA, there was no recovery. The human solution was just as powerless to help us then as it is now. There were a few people probably getting recovery because they had some kind of a spontaneous psychic change that the doctor talked about. But other than that, we were doomed. We were headed for jails, institutions, the crazy house, and death, because we were afflicted with a deadly, incurable, progressive illness. And then all of a sudden, something began to happen. And by the time 1938 rolled around, it was in full bloom. It didn't look like much yet. It was kind of a paltry little garden. A few people in New York, a few people in Cleveland, a few people in Akron. And they were struggling along, and every once in a while somebody would show up. In fact, there were a lot of people who kind of came through those meetings, and they heard the story, heard the message, and then went on their way. Nobody knows how many of them actually carried the message on. But of course, by the time 1938 came around, it was pretty obvious that this fellowship and the 12 steps, which by that time they had developed, not in writing, but by word of mouth, that these steps worked and that people were getting sober. People who had been given up were lost. Chronic alcoholics who were going to die of their disease because nobody could help them. And when we walk in these doors, we need to remember where all of this came from. We have a heritage, given that it is a short time, substantially less time than I've been alive. And yet, what a rich heritage it is. Think about this for a second. 65 years ago, there were 2. 62 years ago, there were maybe 100. Today, there are about 5 million of us all over the world, in almost every country. And our Big Book has been translated into 25 or 26 foreign languages, including, I understand they're working on a Mayan translation right now. And this is a miracle that has occurred. There's something I'd like to impress on you as it's been impressed on me. And in the 36 and a half years I've been around here, it becomes more and more and more obvious that this is true. These 12 steps work. And but for the fact that the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous work, we wouldn't be here. There would be no fellowship. The proof of the pudding is simple. The people who work the steps recover, and those who do not seldom recover. And so as we go through the steps together, we're going to be looking at one of the most amazing revelations, one of the most amazing things happened to the human race, because it has reached out and affected the lives of so many millions and is growing exponentially. The 12 steps may be the last great hope of the world. We're not dealing here with some kind of a nice philosophical little thing that a bunch of guys sat around and dreamed up. We're not dealing here with some treatise that was produced by someone who was a candidate for a PhD. We're not dealing here with the works of an  We're not dealing here with the works of an ecclesiastic. or a medical guy. We're dealing here with the works of a bunch of ordinary people. The one who did the majority of the writing being a stockbroker who had basically been cashiered out of his business. These were the dregs of the earth. These were the people who everybody scorned. Many of these were people who had been given up as dead by the various hospitals and other organizations trying to help them. And yet, from that beginning, we have something of inestimable, priceless value. I want to read something to you. And we'll keep this in mind as we study these steps together. God, in His wisdom, has selected this group of men to be the purveyors of His goodness. In selecting them through whom to bring this phenomenon, He went not to the proud, the mighty, the famous, or the brilliant. He went to the humble, to the sick, to the unfortunate. He went right to the drunkard, the so-called weakling of the world. Well might He have said to us, unto your weak and feeble hands I have entrusted a power beyond estimate. To you has been given that which has been denied to the most learned of your fellows. Not to scientists or statesmen, not to wives or mothers, not even to my priest or minister have I given this gift of healing other alcoholics, which I entrust to you. It must be used unselfishly. It carries with it grave responsibility. No day can be too long. No demand upon your time can be too urgent. No case too pitiable. No task too hard. No effort too great. It must be used with tolerance, for I have restricted its application to no race, no creed, and no denomination. Personal criticism you must expect. Lack of appreciation will be common. Ridicule will be your lot. Your motives will be misjudged. Success will not always attend your efforts in your work with other alcoholics. You must be prepared for adversity, for what men call adversity is a ladder you must use to ascend the rungs toward spiritual perfection. And remember, in the exercise of this power, I shall not exact of you beyond your capabilities. You are not selected because of exceptional talents, and be careful always if success attends your efforts, not to ascribe to personal superiority that which you can lay claim only by virtue of my gift. If I'd wanted learned men to accomplish this mission, the power would have been entrusted to the physicians and the scientists. If I'd wanted eloquent men, there would have been many anxious for the assignment, for talk is the easiest use of all talents with which I have endowed mankind. If I had wanted scholarly men, the world is filled with better qualified men than you who would have been available. You were selected because you have been the outcast of the world, and your long experience as drunkards has made or should make you humbly alert to the cries of distress that come from the lonely hearts of alcoholics everywhere. Keep in mind the admission you made on the day of your entrance into AA, namely, that you are powerless, and that it was only your willingness to turn your life and will into God's keeping that relief came to you. And that's us. And so these steps are a priceless heritage for us. I personally believe that they're divinely inspired. Let me tell you quickly that these steps came about in a most unusual way. Remember that they had never been written down. They were all word of mouth, and many of the people who were passing them by word of mouth were just like us today. There was very little consistency in them. But Bill had been around to the various groups, and he pretty well knew what was going on. When it came time to write these steps down for the very first time, when he was writing the big book, on a night when he was sick, he was lying in his bed, and he started writing, not knowing how many steps there would be, not knowing what the makeup of these steps would be. And when he had finished, 30 minutes later, there were 12 steps, 200 words, the 200 words which are literally changing the world And he looked up in amazement and he said, where did this come from? And right there in the second step was God. And God was liberally scattered throughout the steps. And he realized that without God, there was no recovery. Without a higher power of our own understanding, there was no recovery. That this was a spiritual program from Alpha to Omega, from A to Z. There is no spiritual part of AA. It's all spiritual, each and every step. And we're going to be taking a look at the first step. We need to put aside something which has gotten some very strong play recently, and I don't know where it comes from, but there is somewhere the idea got started that the way that we determine whether we're alcoholics or not is to determine that our lives are unmanageable. If you stop to think about it, that doesn't make any sense at all. Show me some of those normies out there whose lives are manageable by themselves. You see, the very basic idea of our program and of the 12 steps, right down at the rock bottom of everything, is the fact that God has all power and knowledge, and His will is going to be done whether we like it or not, and all of our attempts to manage our own lives will come to naught. The point is, we got to stop playing God. We got to stop being the general manager of our universe. And our whole point is to surrender and to seek knowledge of God's will for us and be willing to be obedient to that will. That's the way our lives turn around. The idea that somehow if we answer a 300 question questionnaire about unmanageability, that we have proven the facts of our alcoholism is a patent absurdity. What the first step is telling us is that because we're alcoholics, we have an unmanageable life. There's no other way around. We are not alcoholics because our lives have become unmanageable. And so this is not something which the Big Book dwells upon at all, with good reason. Let's take a look at the second full paragraph on page 30 now, because the Big Book does describe and define the first step for us, does it not? Let's see what it says. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. Notice what this is saying. First of all, this is something we're going to learn. It's going to come to us. Not something being forced upon us. Not something that's beaten into our heads. Nobody opens up the top of our heads and pours in this concession. It's something we learn. And that means that we have learned because we have taken certain actions, which we're going to talk about in a minute. We learned that we had to fully concede. Now, you know, the Big Book doesn't have any weasel words in it. It doesn't mess around with any if, as, when, comes, and maybes. There doesn't have any bunch of gray areas in it. It tells us straight out, in plain, unambiguous language, what the facts are and what we must do and what the directions are that we must follow. And so it tells us that we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. Innermost selves. This doesn't mean that because we have come to a meeting and announced my name is Jim and I'm an alcoholic, that we've accomplished the first step. We may have, but it doesn't signify that. What then does? The concession to our innermost selves means that this step must be taken without qualifications or reservations of any kind. Now this is something which is almost impossible for us to do when we walk in the door. You know, to ask an alcoholic who's sick, sore, and wounded, can't figure out what's going on, been in a state of denial for years and years and years, to suddenly concede fully to their innermost selves that yes, indeed, I'm an alcoholic. Some can do it, but many, many cannot. They will say it, They will pacify those who are around them, who may even be their sponsors or whatever, or the counselors at the treatment center or down at the detox, or whoever it is that has hold of them at the moment. But has it really happened? This is the question we need to ask. Is this a concession without reservation? Because if there are reservations, we're not going to recover. This is perhaps the single most critical moment in the life of an alcoholic. This is the nexus point beyond which lies recovery. I don't know whether any of you suspect that you have special merit for being here. I know that I do not. And I have considered the fact that I was chosen, and I believe it would be so, to be a member of this wonderful fellowship as an act of grace. And I'm grateful and will be to my dying day that that is so. Because as a result of being given these wonderful tools, these 12 steps to use, I've had a life beyond anything I could ever imagine for myself. To recount what has happened in my days of sobriety would take all night. Nothing so greatly spectacular, but it's been a life far greater than anything ever could have happened to me otherwise. Not to speak of the fact that I would have been dead within a year, I'm certain of that. So now let's think about this business of this disease of alcoholism and what's going on here. This stuff's been around for a long, long time. Recently it was discovered that in the caves outside Peking, China, where they discovered Peking Man, that those guys 225,000 years ago were fermenting berries. And you know that there were a bunch of drunks in those caves. And they didn't have any more chance of survival than we did. We find that alcohol and its attendant terrors and the ravages upon certain members of the human race have been around forever. And strangely enough, lots and lots of people, the vast majority of people, can imbibe alcohol with impunity. But we can't. And we can call this an allergy if we want. Dr. Silkworth thought that that was the best, closest term he could come up with. There's something wrong with us, or let's put it another way, there's something different about us. That when we take alcohol into our bodies, something happens to us. Dr. Silkworth called it a phenomenon of craving. Something happens which physically and mentally drives us to continue to drink, regardless of the consequences. And in many instances until we have reached the total satiation point, saturation point, and we pass out. Many of us, millions of us, unfortunately, have carried that one step further and continue to drink until we die. Why? We don't know for sure, but we do know that we are identifiable. You can pick us out of the population. You can go to any party, and since all of us around here now have a lot of experience with this, we spot the alcoholic right off. The two-fisted drinker, or the double, triple, quadruple dipper. The one who is always running back to the kitchen to fill everybody else's drink. The person with the hip flask. The person we meet at 9 o'clock in the morning who is very busily eating breath mints. Looks like they've just been dragged through the streets and are saying that they had an insomniac night and they probably are coming down with the flu. All of us know about Monday flu. Sometimes Monday and Tuesday flu. And then sometimes it's all week. And then, of course, we learned to run out and find friendly doctors who would medicate us. And some of those medications were pretty damn nice. Wow, that stuff is good. What do you need booze for with this stuff? Plus it's nice and legal. So we've been that route. And that's why we're here, you know. That's why God chose us, just as we read. Because we are the ones who can carry the message, and unfortunately, we are, for the rest of drunks out there who haven't made it yet, we're the only ones. Think about it for a second. When Dr. Bob in his story, the first story in the back of the book, told us exactly how it was. See, Dr. Bob was a town drunk, but everybody was kind to him because he was, of course, he was a medical doctor, and he still had a little bit of practice going, and everybody figured that somehow or another he'd pull himself out of it. But they all took a shot at him. The ministers took a shot at him. The other docs took a shot at him. The psych people took a shot at him. The people in the church and the sisters and everybody. And he even tried out the Oxford bunch, and of course that wasn't very successful. Dr. Bob had a very strong sense of spirituality, and he had tried just about everything he could to get sober. Nothing worked. And all these people were beating him around the head and shoulders about how he could get sober and their particular method would work. When Bill Wilson showed up and sat down and told Dr. Bob his story, he didn't say, "Doc, I know you're a damn drunk, and I got the way for you to get sober, so get on your knees and start to pray, son." He didn't do that at all. He sat down and told Dr. Bob his story, told him how he drank, told him what alcohol did to him, told him how he tried to stop and couldn't, told him about the hospitals, the loss of his jobs, nearly the loss of his home, the hell he'd put his wife through, told him how over and over again he would sit there at the bar and pound on the bar and say, "How in hell did I start this again?" Told him about the total frustration and despair. Told him about the towering rages. Told him about the fear, the anxiety, the terror, the bewilderment, the frustration, despair. Wow, Dr. Bob sat there and listened to him. And you know what? He knew that Bill Wilson knew what he was talking about, because Bill was talking about him too. So he says in his story, this is the first man who ever talked to me about alcoholism who knew what he was talking about. He said, I had to listen to him because he knew. And then he told me that he had been enabled to recover from this dread disease, from this seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, by the exercise of a few simple disciplines, all of which were spiritual. And he said, I listened to that too because I knew that spiritual solution was there, but I just couldn't find it. So you and I have this same task today. Let's think about this for a second. Bill told us the truth in his story. Remember, he was been in the hospital and he had worked the steps as best he could that Ebby had brought to him while he was still in the hospital for the last time. One thing he had not done, of course, was what we now think of as a 12-step. But it came to him while he was in the hospital, he was going to have to get out and carry this message to others, that there must be thousands of alcoholics out there who could benefit from what he had received. And so he talked to Ebby about it, and Ebby said, you're right, Bill, faith without works is dead. All the faith in the world gets you zero, zilch, nada, nothing until you put it to work. Same with us today, isn't it? We can carry all the faith that we want around with us, but if we don't trust God, if we don't put that faith to work, of what value is it to us? Some of you know that that particular phrase is biblical, but it's just as applicable today as it was 2,000 years ago, or when it was first written, probably 10,000 years ago, because people who were thinking people who recognized the truth of matters realized that faith without works was dead. And so Bill said to himself, okay, here's the way it is. If I fail to enlarge and perfect my spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for other people, I cannot survive the certain low spots ahead. And he set about doing just that, and but for that decision, think about it, that was the turning point in our lives as well as his. Suppose that decision had never come to him. Suppose he had gone home and told his wife, I'm sober now, where's the garbage, I'll take it out. Just get off my back now, woman, because I'm not going to drink anymore. And there's a God out there who's going to keep me sober. But instead, he went about the business of seeking out other alcoholics, and Dr. Bob, 6 months later, was the first. Suppose that had not happened. Suppose that when Bill Wilson was in that hotel in Akron, Ohio, instead of going to the phone and calling the minister, he had walked into the bar and gotten drunk. There's a very good chance none of us would be here tonight. Suppose that minister hadn't been home. Suppose he hadn't known Henrietta Sieberling. Suppose she didn't know about Dr. Bob. Suppose Dr. Bob wasn't willing to see this strange guy from New York. Suppose Bill hadn't by that time talked to Dr. Silkworth and he knew then what he was going to have to do to get through. Suppose all of that had not happened. I shudder to think of it. There are 80 or 90 of us sitting here tonight who wouldn't be here. And many of us have been long gone dead. You see, it's upon all of these things that we begin to see our sobriety and our fellowship hinging. The hand of God is in here. Make no mistake about it. I'm convinced, and I hope you will be if you're not already, that we were brought in here, not driven, that we're here through the grace of God, that He wants us here, and that He has chosen us, and that we have a duty and a mission to perform. And that we're here precisely because we are the ones who can carry His message. Because we are the ones who have been there before. We're the chosen messengers, and this is our duty, but it is also our salvation. And may I say again, unless we are willing to work and self-sacrifice for others, we have a terrible time. We're going to walk around with untreated alcoholism, sometimes for years and years, never knowing really what's wrong with us, keeping a brave face to the world, pretending, covering up. Sooner or later, something comes along that we cannot handle, and we drink again. And people call that a slip. It's not a slip. It was absolutely to be expected. It was going to happen. It was only a question of when. So when all of this started to come together, remember that Bill had been introduced to recovery through the Oxford group. Now, if you've got your big book there, if you turn to page 292, please, you will see one version of the Oxford group 6 steps. We find them in different versions, but this gives us a flavor, an idea of what they were. And as you read these, you're going to see that there are a bunch of holes here that have since been plugged up by the 12 steps that we practice. The first of these is complete deflation. And we can take that to mean the same as our first step. 2, dependence and guidance from a higher power, perhaps the second and third step. 3, the moral inventory, which is our 4th step. Confession, our 5th step. Now, by the way, because the Oxford group was a religious society, they dealt with confession. In AA, we don't. Not at least in the religious sense of that word. In its generic sense, I suppose, yes, we do. 5, restitution, which is tantamount to our 9th step, is it not? And then continued work with other alcoholics, which is part of at least our 12th step. Now, there's a lot missing in there, but this is what these guys had to work with. Remember, they were all men. Most of them were middle-aged or older. Most of them have been really racked by alcohol. Many of them had reached very, very low bottoms. And yet it was these 6 steps which brought them recovery. Now, as they were in the process of recovering, through trial and error, they began to recognize that these 6 steps were insufficient. The basic stuff is here, but more was needed. Especially, they found out that once they had achieved a certain degree of spiritual fitness, they were going to be thereafter out living in the world, and the world and all of its people would continue to threaten them. And that therefore fear coming back would warp again their natural instincts, would bring back the defects of character which they brought in with them, and that they needed to have a way to be constantly vigilant against the recurrence of this and to deal with it when it came up. And as a result of that, we have the 10th step, and we've got part of the 11th step that resulted from that. And there were intermediate steps that they realized were important, the 6th step, for example, and the 8th step. So these were added. What they did was to provide a continuum. That continuum is recited in the 12th step, to practice these principles in all of our affairs, meaning that we're going to work these steps in everything we do from here on. And when we do that, we will remain spiritually fit, and we will remain sober, and we will remain capable of carrying this message. Let's go back to the first paragraph. Most of us have been unwilling to admit that we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Therefore, it is not surprising that our drinking careers have been characterized by countless vain attempts to prove we could drink like other people. Listen to this now. The idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. And when we hear that being read in the meetings, we've got to think what it's saying. These are not light words. This is not just kind of trips over the tongue, you know. We can't afford to ignore what it's saying. This great obsession of every abnormal drinker is something that kills us, because we do not want to face the prospect of life without alcohol. The truth is, we cannot continue to drink, but we cannot conceive of not drinking. And so, since we're dealing here with something which is, first of all, of enormous importance, critical, life-shattering importance. I mean, this is something that we cannot afford to take the first step and dismiss it as something which simply occurs because we drank too much. And because we're dealing here with that terrible phenomena which is the hallmark of our disease, that the denial that we've been in all of these years, in which we have found every reason, every way to escape the knowledge that we could not drink successfully, that we were killing ourselves, that alcohol was a poison to us. We couldn't face that, and we found every possible way to deny the existence of this dread disease. Not only that, but when we walk in the door, most of us have been in a state of rebellion and defiance. We have come to a point where we have either denied the existence of a higher power or have been ignoring the God of our childhood completely, sometimes for years and years, finding every kind of a reason and excuse to say there is no God. So something's going to have to happen here, and happen mighty quick. Now there's another factor involved, isn't there? Let's go down to that last sentence in that second paragraph. Listen to this now, because this is the other part of the first step. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. Turn back, please, now to page Roman 26, XXVI. XXVI, Roman 26. This is in the doctor's opinion. Let's listen to what the doctor has to say here. Go to the first full paragraph, halfway down the middle of that paragraph. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all, and once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Go back. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. The first step tells us, requires of us that we come to believe and to accept the fact that the plug is in the jug permanently. And if we have reservations about that, God's help us, because we're going to carry those reservations forward into the balance of the steps, and we're going to be constantly looking for that out, that way that we can suddenly find ourselves cured, or at least confident enough that we can begin to drink again. We did not want to acknowledge or accept the fact that we were through drinking for good and all. Let's go to Dr. Bob's opinion, Dr. Bob's story, please, because he tells us about this. Page 181, please. Here's the rule now, guys. It's in the last paragraph on page 181. Everybody got that? Go down halfway in that paragraph. But if you really and truly want to quit drinking liquor for good and all, and sincerely feel that you must have some help, we know that we have an answer for you. Listen to this. It never fails. It never fails. If you go about it with one half the zeal you've been in the habit of showing when you were getting another drink. See how that works? And Dr. Bob was a man of extreme veracity. He was a guy who did not lie. He did not exaggerate. He took over 5,000 people under his wing to help them recover during his time on earth. Champion 12-stepper of all time. And he tells us flat out, it never fails. If you sincerely want to stop drinking for good and all. Now, if you extrapolate from that, what we're looking at here with the first step, then you realize just how critical it is that we accept the fact that the plug is in the jug for good. Any reservations about that are sure to cripple us in our recovery. So now we know that we're going to have to come to a place where we have learned that we must fully concede to our innermost selves we're alcoholic, and that we're going to have to be willing and able to give up alcohol for good and all, to recognize that we can never safely drink again the rest of our lives, that we are in fact alcoholics. The question then is, how does this come about? Is it something which can be forced upon us? Is it something which you can go to lectures and learn about and you'll say, yeah, man, that's just right. Oh, sure, I understand that. They try that all the time. Some men's group is putting on Father Martin's Chalk Talk, which is a very interesting movie. I guess it's probably on videotape now. He did that years and years ago, I think in the early 70s. And it's funny as heck. Father Martin's a very humorous guy. And it was shown in every treatment center, and probably is still being shown in every treatment center. And as far as I know, it never got anybody sober. But it is funny. It's a lot of fun. Let's see now. How do I get you to take your first step? I take you in and I scare the pants off of you about this alcohol stuff and what it's going to do to you. And I show you maybe pictures of ruined stomachs and this kind of stuff. I show you charts and graphs. I give you all kinds of medical opinions, and the more you look at it, the more you realize that, man, there's no doubt about it. I've come to believe that alcoholism is indeed a deadly, incurable disease. I know that that's the truth. There's no doubt about it. But so what? The fear of the next drink, the fear of the consequences of drinking, may help us to stay sober right after we come through the door. But nobody stays sober for their lifetime on fear. Nobody. When you think in terms of you got to keep it green, if you don't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it, forget it. I mean, that's fine, that's good stuff, but it doesn't come out of the big book, because the big book never tells us don't drink. You know that? You're not going to tell a bunch of alcoholics don't drink when they can't not drink. That's why the hell they're here. They can't not drink. They're looking for a solution. The solution is a spiritual one. The other way that we can try to go about getting you to take your first step is to psychoanalyze you. We can go put you through all kinds of encounter groups. We can do aversion therapy. We can shock the hell out of you. We can give you hot baths and we can give you cold baths. We can give you one facilitator after another, all kinds of encounter groups, and we'll have all sorts of people willing to, is what they say these days, and I don't ascribe to this language, but calling us on our shit. So what? The big book is quite clear about this. We don't get sober because of self-knowledge. Look at what happened with Roland H., his stories in the book. Roland went over and got Dr. Young to give him a whole year of his tender, loving mercies on his couch. And Dr. Young was one of the most important psychiatrists of his day. He and Adler and Freud were the three top dogs. And Dr. Young took Roland and just tore him up. He tore all his psyche a whole apart, and he gave him a whole new psyche. Roland, when he came back to the United States, knew everything there was to know about himself, and Dr. Young was of the opinion that if Roland knew why he drank, he'd stop drinking. Well, you and I know that that's utter nonsense. That ain't going to stop us from drinking. What's the whole point here? We are powerless over alcohol. Powerless. Which means quite simply that we have no power on our own to stop drinking, no matter what the provocation, no matter what the fears may be. I have a dear friend of mine who was on life support last Sunday, and by Tuesday she was out drinking again. And you all know people like that. I have a dear friend who's sitting here in this room right now who can testify to that. I mean, so what's going to happen here? We've got a deadly, incurable, progressive illness which is not amenable to human solutions. Every time you hear the three pertinent ideas, remember that. The human solutions, if they worked, would obviate the need for any of us to be here. We could all go get psychoanalyzed, or we could have the pants scared off of us and then we'd never drink again. It just doesn't work. And so because we are powerless, we have to have a power. Look at page 45. Second paragraph. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. Remember, we've already learned that alcohol is but a symptom of our problem. Lack of power, that's our dilemma. And we have to find a power by which we can live. It has to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how are we to find this power? Next paragraph. Well, that's exactly what this book's all about. Its main purpose is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Notice that? That's a flat statement, isn't it? 2 sentences down, another flat statement. This means we're going to talk about God. No pussyfooting around there. We're not saying, oh golly gee whiz, we don't want that new guy walking in off the street, that no woman walking off the street to try and walk back out because somebody mentions God to them. Okay, so we're powerless. What's the solution? we're going to have to put a power greater than ourselves between us and booze. Nothing else will work. To do that, we must start off with the proposition that we're powerless over alcohol, that we are alcoholics, and that we can no longer ever safely drink alcohol the rest of our lives. Now, how are we going to go about doing that when everything in us militates against it? Everything that we've learned, everything we've been taught, all of the stuff that we may have learned or thought we learned. What is this business of surrendering to a higher power? I've never been taught to surrender. I've been taught to fight. Been taught to get out and gouge and fight and scratch and make my way. Get power. What's this business of being powerless? I can have power. There are 55 books right now down at the bookstore that tell me various ways of getting power. And everybody's talking about being empowered. The hell kind of power are we talking about? Well, of course, people give us power temporarily if we've got something on them. If we're paying their bills, for example, or their salary, or we're carrying a gun, or we live in Washington in one of those stately places and exercise the power of the tax or the power of the sword, we give them power. But it is temporary, it is temporal, it is not real power, it is something which is ceded to us by other humans. Because why? Because as it tells us in chapter 5, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Now then, let's take a look at the 7th chapter. Please turn your books to page 95. And we're going to see what the spiritual solution is to this dilemma of the first step. How is it that we're going to come to a concession to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic? On page 95, remember that this occurs in the 7th chapter, and it occurs after we have already been working with somebody who's new, and we have told them our story, and we've told them about how we recovered, and they are very interested now in hearing and going further with us. Look at the second full paragraph right in the third full paragraph right in the middle of the page, 2/3 of the way down. This is the newcomer we're talking about now. If he is sincerely interested and wants to see you again, ask him to read this book in the interval. I've had about 15 people get after me in the last 2 weeks. What do you mean, read the whole book? Well, I'm sorry if that disturbs you, but that's what it says, isn't it? Read this book. In fact, if you want to just a quick little bit of AA trivia, on page 112, the first 3 words on 112, take a look, see what they are. Right at the top of the page, first 3 words. Everybody find that? First 3 words on page 112. Okay. So let's go on here now. Remember now, we're talking about solutions tonight. We're not talking about fairy tales. We're not talking about wannabe stuff. We're talking about what really works. Ask him to read this book in the interval. After doing that, after he's read the book, he must decide for himself whether he wants to go on. He should not be pushed or prodded by you, his wife, or his friends. Listen to this now. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. That means from within him. And we aren't in any position to be injecting people with that desire. It's got to come to them. We're getting close now to the answer, aren't we? There's going to have to be some kind of a gift here, isn't there? Going to have to be some kind of an infusion of spiritual power for this to happen. Let's go to the next page, 96. Middle paragraph, paragraph number 2. Suppose now you're making your second visit to a man. He has read this volume and says he is prepared to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. In other words, he's saying, I want what you have. I'm willing to go to any lengths to get it. And you're saying, therefore, you are ready to take the steps. Having had the experience yourself, you can give him much practical advice. Let him know you're available if he wishes to make a decision and tell a story, but do not insist upon it if he prefers to consult someone else. At the second meeting, my friends, we take them immediately to the steps. So now we know that one of the things which is going to be most critical to this first step is to read the book. Well, why is that? It's very simple. This book was written for the newcomer. That's why they wrote the book. They couldn't get around to all these people. They couldn't go to Cucamonga. They couldn't go down to El Paso. They weren't anywhere near some place in Pierre, South Dakota. And I come from a little place called Polson, Montana. And then they knew that there were places besides in the United States. They needed to get this message out. To whom? To the newcomer. That's why the book was written. That's why we read the whole book. Because it is designed specifically for the new person. To do two things initially. First, to break down the walls of denial by allowing the new person to identify themselves with all the characters in the book. Starting right out with Bill's story, which is a hard-hitting story, and many people don't have to go much further than that before they get the idea. Somewhere in the pages of this big book, they are going to find themselves, and they're going to say, aha, that's me. And this person has written their story, and they have told me that they're just like me, and that they're alcoholic. And more than that, that they recovered. So what's the second thing the big book brings to us? It's hope. What's the second chapter heading? There is a solution. It doesn't say, oh golly gee whiz, there might just kind of possibly sort of be a solution. It says there is a solution. That's a pretty definite statement, isn't it? All right, so now we know that the reason the new person is going to read this book is because it was written for them. Why would we tell them, don't read something that was specifically written for you? You don't have to do that. You're going to read as your sponsor sees it. The Reader's Digest expurgated and deleted version. Or just read the first 3 chapters and then we'll see where you are. By the way, stay sober for 90 days before you even bother me. Because I want to be sure you plan to stay around. I don't want to waste my time with you. And by the way, I'll tell you when you're ready for the steps. Oh, God. Now then, what else do we need to do? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that we need to get to meetings. Lots and lots of meetings. Because in these meetings, God is present. There's a strong spiritual force here. There's a synergism at work. This place right now, if we were to all stop and start praying and meditating, we would probably bust out the walls. There's enough spiritual force in here to rock the place, and Tom wouldn't like that. We did it together about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and the windows were rattling, I know that.
Had to fix the lights.
They had to fix the lights all burned out. But what's going on here? There's something. You see, the new person is not even going to know what the hell's happening to them, but something's happening, and they go to the meeting and they they go to the meeting and something happens. They come out of that meeting and they feel good. They feel better. Also, what about they go to a meeting, maybe, just maybe, if they get real lucky, they might even hear solutions talked about rather than problems. Because a lot of people don't realize that this fellowship is not named Problems Anonymous. This is Alcoholics Anonymous. And we talk about solutions in here, just as we're doing together tonight. So maybe they're going to hear some solutions. Then also what's going to happen is they're going to meet some people. They're going to meet some people who have real recovery, solid recovery, people who walk the walk, people who are demonstrating in their very lives that God is working in and through them. They're going to meet these people. They're going to talk to them. And all of these things, the big book, the meetings, talking with other alcoholics who are in recovery, would all be fine and wonderful, but there's one thing missing, and Dr. Silkworth pointed out to us. The last word in Dr. Silkworth's opinion is pray. He said, you may come to scoff, but hopefully you'll stay to pray. Because he saw what was happening in his hospital. He saw that these hopeless, helpless cases he'd given up on, these chronic alcoholics he could no longer help. And the guys from AA were coming in there and talking to these guys, and they'd talk to them for 2 or 3 days. Then all of a sudden he would see they were praying together. He said, wow, they're praying together. A day or two later, this hopeless, helpless case would get up and walk out. And a month later, he'd be back in there, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and helping the next person in line. But Dr. Silkworth couldn't fail to see what was going on. He tells us, you might come to scoff, but hopefully you'll stay to pray. The last word in his opinion is pray. Now, here's the way it works. You may be brand new, and you may be saying, I hate God, there is no God. If I'm not God, there is no God, on and on, all the stuff. Somebody's got to get to you and say, look, you want recovery, you want to get this first step, here's the way you do it. You start praying just as if there is a God. Pray to whom it may concern. Pray to God if you're there, but pray. You see, because the truth is, and we know it because it's happened to us already, the truth is that God's just waiting for us to open that door one little crack, just a little crack. He's going to come flooding through. Here's the way Bill Wilson put it. He said, I learned I had to pray just as if there were a God. And when all the miracles started coming and I could no longer deny that they came from this power greater than myself, that's when faith came. And we do the same thing. So we're going to read the book, go to meetings, talk to people in recovery, and pray. Now, when we do these 4 things, these are the actions we take. These are the spiritual actions we take, which will lead us to what? This great gift. The great gift of a concession to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic and that we can never safely drink alcohol again. And that's the way that step works. And when we do those things, it never fails. It always works. And be careful, because if you're having the first step forced on you, if you think you're getting the first step through human solutions, if the first step is a function only of finding out why your life is unmanageable, you may be in deep trouble. Because we have to have this first step in order for us to go on. Now, next week, we're going to be plunging directly into the question, God either is or he isn't. God's either everything or he's nothing. We're going to be plunging directly into this question, are you willing to believe or not? Because without that belief, where do we go from there? And God save us if we try to fake that one.